And kicking us off this afternoon is someone we all know and love, Rachel Engler-Stringer. Dr. Rachel Engler-Stringer. Rachel is a professor in the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan and a researcher with the Saskatchewan Population Health and Evaluation Research Unit. She convenes the School Food Working Group of Canadian Association for Food Studies and currently leads 3 large school food projects. Rachel is also an avid cook and takes great satisfaction from growing some of her own food in her inner city front and backyards. Without further ado, everyone, Dr. Rachel Engler-Stringer.
Hello, everyone. So my job this afternoon is to put all of the discussions that we're having, so hearing about the amazing programs that exist in other places, thinking about ways in which programs here in Saskatchewan and your communities could be built upon, could grow in whatever ways work for your communities, putting all of that in the context of Canada and the world. So I'm going to be talking to you about what I've learned about school food globally and nationally, and what role it plays, and I want to sort of plant some seeds. I always use gardening metaphors. Plant some seeds towards how we might think about how we fit within the larger context. So I put an asterisk after my name and my degree because I'm the only person listed here, but I'm not the only person whose knowledge is in this presentation. It's just way too hard to put, honestly, dozens of people's names on this. So what I want to just say is what I'm presenting is a synthesis of what I've learned over many years about school food, from talking to practitioners, from speaking to other academics, from going to conferences, all of those things. So I'm the author, but I'm not really the author. Just like all of us, right? We're all a sum of all of the people and places that who have influenced us. Where's my? Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so once kids reach school age, I'm sure this is not news to any of us, kids spend the majority of their waking hours at school. So schools are a very, very important context for children and their development. In terms of food and eating, what we know from national surveys in Canada is that kids consume about 1/3 of what they eat in a day while at school. Whether they're in a school food program, they're bringing food to school, whether they leave school grounds and go to the convenience store next door, by whatever means, it's about 1/3 of the food they consume is consumed during that school day. We also know from nutrition research that it is far easier to influence children and their eating habits than it is to influence adults. We become set in our ways as we age. I can see it happening to me. I try to fight against it, but nonetheless. But kids have really great ability to adapt and to change. And while some may be resistant, overall, kids are easier to influence in terms of their food and eating than us adults are. And that in the school context, we have the privilege, joy, perhaps sometimes exhausting role of having a lot of kids together in one place. And so the potential for influencing is greater because of just simply the number of kids in one place at one time. Canada is actually quite unique among its peers we are one of the only rich countries that does not have some sort of national school food policy or program. So if you think of other countries that are similar in terms of affluence to Canada, we are very unusual. United States has a national school food program, France does, Italy does, Japan does, all throughout the UK, these exist. Canada is actually quite an unusual context. In fact, globally, it's close to 3/4 of kids receive a meal at school. Now, it isn't always free. Sometimes parents pay for it. But globally, it is about 3/4 of kids receive a meal at school. We also know that there's surveys done every 2 years through the Canadian Community Health Survey, but basically there's a survey that's done of health and nutrition across Canada that's done on a regular basis. And what we find from that data is that children in general in Canada, across the socioeconomic spectrum, so meaning it's not just kids from low-income families, it's all kids, are eating quite poorly overall. So Canadian kids as a group are not eating very well in terms of their diet, their overall diet quality. This is not, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this. I hear very frequently, oh, it's a problem of low-income families. That's not true. It's a problem of all families. And it's not necessarily, it's about a whole lot more than, it's about a lot of things. It's about the fact that we live busy lives, and if one kid brings something, all the other kids want to bring, it's a whole lot of things that are kind of converging together that create this situation. Yeah, I think I've kind of said the third point there. There's also evidence from across the world that school food programs, especially when they are integrated into curriculum, so meaning they involve not just eating a meal or eating a snack or whatever it might be, but also include learning about food, learning to cook, participating in cooking, learning about growing food, all of those things. So the term we use is multi-component, that the strongest evidence in terms of the positive benefits of school food programs are when they are integrated into the curriculum in some way. And the positive benefits of school food programs are greater for younger kids than older kids, which again probably doesn't surprise anyone. As kids get older and they start to exercise their freedom muscles, they start to go and do their own thing, and so as a result often don't even participate as much as younger kids. Food is an incredible educational tool. We can learn about the world around us through food. So everything from our political system, our economic system, we can learn about that through thinking about how our food system works. Why is it that in some neighborhoods there is good access to vegetables and fruit, while in other neighborhoods there isn't? What is that about? What does that tell us about our political and economic system? Those kinds of questions are questions that they're framed around food, but they're really about the bigger picture. What's going on in our society? How we value people, how we value places. I mean, there's just so many ways you can use food to think about the world around you. And again, we know from the evidence that exists from other places in the world that children really can learn many of these issues, about many of these issues in age-appropriate ways in the context of food and cooking and school food programs. So there's just, I mean, they're like, I've summarized it in a couple of points, but there's actually a ton of research in this area showing all sorts of different ways that food can be used as a tool, as an educational tool. And certainly, I think you've heard this already in the last day and a bit, is that students can learn both appreciation for food and a willingness to try food in the context of school food programs, especially if they're preparing that food, and also over time. So there's also some evidence that we have to be patient. So we have to, it can often take many months for kids to try things, for kids to be willing to try foods that are unfamiliar to them and so on. But that we have to do that sort of with patience over time. So we can't just try something new and then if we don't think it works, that it sort of doesn't work, that we need to give it time. Okay. So in terms of, again, the big picture of the literature around school food programs, the strongest evidence from an academic standpoint is around attendance, specifically around attendance, decreased tardiness, and decreased dropout rates. So that is where we have the strongest evidence. So it was interesting that sort of anecdotally here in Saskatoon, I mean, I've been working with teachers and folks at Saskatoon Public Schools for a number of years. And when they initially started their school food programs, the programs that currently exist, it was because of attendance, especially full day attendance, or at least this is what I've been told, is that kids would come to school in the morning, they'd get hungry, they'd go home looking for something to eat, and they wouldn't come back to school in the afternoon. So that's what I heard. So it's consistent with the evidence globally. So attendance, decreased tardiness, decreased dropout rates appear to be the strongest, where there's the strongest evidence when it comes to school food programs. In terms of academic achievement, there is some evidence. There's very little from Canada, and this is in part because we're such an unusual country on this front, but there is some evidence that school food programs can reduce education inequalities, meaning educational outcomes for those from higher socioeconomic versus lower socioeconomic families. So there is some evidence around that, but mostly it's global, not Canadian. We haven't been doing research on this for very long in Canada, frankly. So it's, we're always trying to draw on what we've learned from other countries. Oh. It's a very sensitive, okay. So I do want to talk to you a little bit about the history in Canada. So there actually were many school food programs in Canada just over 100 years ago, so early 20th century, especially in the bigger cities. There's numerous examples from Toronto, from Montreal, from Ottawa, of school food programs that were, in fact, actually quite a large number of them. There's actually a book, if any of you are like me, really into reading about things that are food related, there's a book called Food Will Win the War, written by my brilliant colleague Ian Mosby, and in it he's got a chapter. So it's about food in the Second World War. He's a historian, and there's a chapter in it about school food programs and sort of the history of school food programs in Canada. So let me know if you want me to send you a link to that book. It's a pretty interesting book. So there were school food programs as of well over 100 years ago, especially in the bigger cities. They were funded by a combination of charities, municipal governments, and provincial governments. And there was a major push for a national school food program in Canada during the Second World War. globally, this was also the case. So most countries around the world that have school food programs got them in the aftermath of the Second World War. That is the most common scenario. And the same thing was happening in Canada at that time. There was this real push, and the Red Cross was sort of spearheading, along with, oddly enough, Chatelaine magazine was a big part of the push. I think because it was a women's magazine and it was sort of, women in school food programs. There's I think women in particular can see the benefits. And then what happened was at the end of the Second World War, there were a number of social programs that were put in place as soldiers were coming back from war, as the government was trying to encourage women to stop working and to go back to being at home, because women, in very large numbers started working outside the home during the Second World War. The federal government was looking for ways to encourage women to have social programs that supported people in the aftermath of war, but at the same time encourage women to go back to being at home with their children. And so instead of a national school food program, Canada got the family allowance. So if you're my age or older, you probably remember the family allowance. I remember my mother receiving her family allowance check. It was put in place. It was a small amount of money that was supposed to be to support women to make sure their kids were fed and clothed and so on. But it was discontinued in the early 1990s. So the family allowance was an excellent social program. There's plenty of evidence to show that it brought many families out of poverty. However, it was insufficient. But at the time, what the government said was, well, if we put this in place, there's no excuse for people not eating well. In fact, that's almost an exact quote. I've got the quote somewhere. And so the belief was, there was, the social programs that existed were plenty. We did not need a national school food program. And interestingly, there's a really interesting book that was on the politics of different countries and why they started school food programs or not. And basically, the countries that were more focused on encouraging women to go home and stay at home didn't start national school food programs, and countries where they wanted to continue to support women to work outside the home, they did start national school food programs. So, yeah, there's my little history lesson, I guess. But right now, we're at a moment in time where there is probably more momentum towards the establishment of some sort of national school food program or policy than there has been at any time since the Second World War. So the last time any federal government was even talking about it was like 1947. It's been a really long time, but right now, I'll give you a couple of examples, but in 2019, so this is from the federal budget in 2019. And so what it says is, currently Canada has a mix of different school breakfast and lunch programs, but much more could be done. Budget 2019 announces the government's intention to work with provinces and territories towards the creation of a national school food program. So it was the first time since the Second World War that the federal government said anything, frankly, about some sort of national school food program. And then, and in large part, we have to give credit to the Coalition for Healthy School Food for making this happen. They have been working, so this organization, of which any of your communities, your schools, school boards, could become members. So this is a coalition of, what is the number right now? Right now it's over 200. It's constantly increasing, but over 200 organizations in every province and territory working together towards some sort of national school food program for Canada. So they had been working for a number of years before the budget announcement in 2019. Now, the problem with the budget announcement is that it came with $0. It actually mentioned school food, but there was no money attached. Just a bit of history globally, just very, very briefly. In the initial phase of school food programs that were established, in various places in the world, they initially were about hunger, and they were often about soldiers' readiness for war. So in the context of a war, what would happen is men would be drafted, and they would have to go through some sort of physical exam, and there's in many, many cases around the world, they would be finding too many men who were malnourished, and as such were not fit to fight in a war. And so quite frequently, that's why school food programs were established initially. But then in the 1970s especially, and it took longer than that in the US and the UK, but starting in the 1970s, over about a 30-year period, we started to see a shift towards thinking about nutrition. So not simply about having enough calories, feeding hungry bellies, but ensuring that the food was nutritionally sound, that there were, looking at that it was consistent with food guides, those sorts of things. So it took quite a while to get to that point. And most recently, and this is where we are at, I would argue right now, is what is described as the third phase of school food programs. And this is where school food programs are focused on incorporating broader food system and societal issues, integration with curricula, and the broader school environment. So school food programs that are about more than the food, they're about people, they're about connection to community, and they're about what's happening around us. So, thinking about school food programs and school food programs sort of being used as a way to think about climate change, for example. So these big societal issues that we're facing. A few years ago, I was part of a group that did this big synthesis of literature from around the world, and we put together principles, basically, for what we thought, based upon the evidence that we found around the world, for what should be included in the best possible school food program for Canada if Canada were to establish a national program. This is written really small, but I will summarize the principles. So the first one is universality, that everyone can participate. Many programs, especially the United States is one of the most sort of notorious examples. Programs tend to be targeted at low-income kids. And there's plenty of evidence to show that not only is that stigmatizing when some kids are offered a meal at school and other kids aren't, but there's actually a very significant group of kids who won't participate because their parents are, for all sorts of reasons, not wanting to be labeled as, quote, poor. And so there's a lot of kids who wouldn't have access to food otherwise, but don't participate because of programs being targeted and there being stigma associated with them. Whereas programs that are offered to all kids are seen much more positively by families, by children, and so on. So the first principle is universality. The second principle is being health promoting, and I don't mean simply following Canada's food guide, although that is certainly part of being health promoting, means that the school food program is, the foods are, nutritious foods, but that the foods are also reflective of the food cultures of the people in that school community, but that the programs are health promoting. The third is that they are respectful, and this is connected to health promoting, meaning that the program is, that there's control over programs by those people who are involved in them, that the program reflects the needs, the wants of that school community. So it's not programs that are, someone conceives of a program in one place and just plops it down somewhere else and implements it. That there's this ability that it needs to be respectful of the context. So culturally appropriate and locally adapted. Programs in diverse inner cities will look different from those in remote northern communities. For example, an involvement by stakeholders with local experience is critical to success. Okay, the fourth is connected. That programs are connected to their local communities, that they use local resources, that they draw upon local producers where possible, and that they engage broader communities, so families, grandparents, elders, even local businesses and so on, that they are connected to their communities, that they're multi-component. Remember, I talked about that before, that they're integrated with curriculum, so in the classroom, that there's classroom components beyond the meal itself. And then finally, that they're sustainable. And the way we conceived of sustainable here is sustainable in the sense of funding. So right now, at least here in Saskatoon, I know that the school food programs that exist, every year they have to apply for funds and piece together a whole bunch of small grants to make it all work in their schools. This is very common in Canada to have situations where schools are basically cobbling together what they need in order to run a program. So by sustainable, what we mean is that funding is longer term. So similar to what the description from the Yukon First Nations Education Directorate. Still not long term, but it's longer term. And I would say the same thing with what Scott was talking about this morning. But that also, the sustainability aspect also includes funding for training so that the people who are involved in school food programs are able to constantly build and develop their skills to do what it is that they do. So those were the key characteristics that we observed in synthesizing the literature. I also couldn't help, I know other people have mentioned it as well, that we're at this interesting moment in time where for the first time, Canada has a food guide that is far more whole food focused than we've ever had before. So no more of this sort of food groups. Scott was talking about this morning. We now have a food guide that is far more focused on a much sort of simpler approach to eating. Eat lots of vegetables and fruit, eat whole grains, drink water, much, much simpler kinds of messaging than the kind of messaging that we've had in the past. And I would argue, along with some of my colleagues, that this creates an opportune moment. Like, how do we implement this without a national school food program? That's the argument that I've been making. Is I don't actually think this is anything other than aspirational unless we have every child in our country eating meals at school. So that guide also talks about being mindful, cooking more often, enjoying your food, eating with others. So there's a whole series of principles with Canada's new food guide. Now, it's not perfect. I know there are critiques of it, but from the point of view of thinking about food and eating in a much more holistic way, this is a significant step forward. And I think that talking about Canada's food guide and how we're actually going to bring it into people's lives and make it possible for people to eat this way, one of the ways we do that is through school food programs. Okay, and then just quickly, I wanted to talk to you about a couple of projects that we've done in the past, just because I think people ask these questions a lot. So we decided here in Saskatoon, we worked with 2 school divisions, one urban, one rural, a few years ago, and we decided to go out and see what kids were eating at school. And so we went into elementary schools in, sort of outside of Saskatoon and in Saskatoon, and we took pictures of what kids were eating at school, whether they were in a school food program, because there are some school food programs, or whether they were bringing food from home. And what we found did not surprise any of us, based upon what we find in the evidence around the world, was that students in meal programs, even though our meal programs are so underfunded and have such minimal resources, even under those circumstances, students in meal programs had the highest diet quality scores using the Healthy Eating Index. So these are tools we use to measure diet, adapted for school hours. So that the meal program kids had higher diet quality scores compared to the kids who were bringing their lunches from home. The students who were not in meal programs had a very high proportion of the calories in their foods coming from the category of minimally nutritious food. This is a nutrition term, but minimally nutritious foods are those foods that do not fit into the food groups. So meaning the foods that are really high in sugar, really high in sugar, really high in fats, and so on, and sodium. And so kids not in meal programs had over a third of what they brought to school were foods that fit in that category. While school food programs did not achieve the full recommendations for that sort of where we would like to be when it comes to diet quality, they came far, far closer than what kids were bringing from home. Again, this is across neighborhoods, this is across communities, so this is consistent with what we've seen evidence globally. We were asked a couple of years ago by Saskatoon Public Schools if we would survey parents about their attitudes towards school food programs. Would they be interested in a school food program if one were offered in their child's school? Because right now, there are some schools, like I said, that offer school food programs, but the vast majority of them do not. Or if they do, it's like one or a couple of lunches delivered each day from CHEP's central kitchen. And so what we did is we randomly sampled schools across Saskatoon in different neighborhoods, so high, mid, and low socioeconomic neighborhoods. And we invited those schools to participate, and the principals invited parents to participate, caregivers, not parents and caregivers. And what we found was when we described what a school food program would look like, so it was like, if this program existed and we described a program, would you want your child to participate? 9 out of 10 parents said they would. A very, very high proportion of parents. Because Saskatoon Public is, like all education systems, especially in the province of Saskatchewan right now, very underfunded, there was a concern that the school division couldn't offer programs that would be free for every child, that would not be possible to do. And so they also wanted us to ask about parents making a contribution towards a school food program. And when we asked parents if they would be willing to pay a portion of the cost, it was close to 3/4 of parents said they would. So again, a very high proportion of parents said they'd be willing to make a contribution. Not everyone, but a significant proportion. And then when we asked them about what was most important in terms of characteristics of school food programs, the characteristic that actually came out the most important was integration with curriculum. That there be curricular components, that they learn about food and eating and growing food, those sorts of things, as part of the school food program. And then after that, the next most important was that the food be nutritious and that it be universal. So even though we don't have this yet in Canada, when given a description of what a school food program could look like, parents got that universality is important, that all kids should be participating or should be able to participate. Some colleagues and I have a book chapter that's not yet published. We've been given permission to share the unpublished version because we're waiting for publication. But what we did, this book chapter, I can share it with anyone who would like to read it. So based upon our learning about school food programs over the last number of years, the conclusion that we came to is that any school food program, any national school food program in Canada should fulfill these three key critical characteristics. So the first being that children should be front and center. Children, the school food programs are aimed at kids. They should also include kids. Kids should have a say in how they are run, in what is offered, in all aspects of school food programs. There was an example that one of my colleagues drew upon in BC, where there was a school food program that existed, and they switched to sort of a different catering model where they had an outside caterer come in. They no longer had school food workers. And the kids found that it upset them, because to them, the people who cooked their food at their school were really important to them. They had really important relationships with those people. And so they found the new program that was a purely outside catering to be, they didn't have the same relationship building that they had with adults. It was sort of this importance of caring relationships with adults. The second piece being health and well-being, but seeing health and well-being holistically. It's not just about nutrition, it's about connection to community, it's about all of those social relationships and so on. And then the third being a focus on justice and equity, meaning that school food programs should be universal, so that we should do everything in our power to ensure that they are not stigmatizing, that there's not this sort of dual system between those who can pay and those who can't, or those who can bring their lunch and those who can't, that sort of thing. And one of the arguments that I had contributed to this chapter was that personally, I think that the most innovation that is happening in school food in Canada is in Indigenous communities. And so I made the argument that Indigenous communities should be first. If we're going to only have a small amount of funding to start, and it's going to slowly build across Canada, that it should begin with Indigenous communities. Because frankly, you're the ones that are doing the best work already. And the rest of us can learn from it. Okay, that's it for me. Sorry, that was a bit of a whirlwind. I think we have time for a few questions.
Any questions?
There's a lot of information. Sure, I guess I could talk. There's a lot of information there, a lot of coalesced information. So we probably all have a lot of deeper questions. We just need to revisit the words again. So I would love to see, like, if you could share the maybe a PDF or something, or the presentation.
Oh yes, yeah. So with all of the speakers here, we're sharing the actual presentations.
Okay. Oh yes.
So there's that, and then if anybody would like to actually have a copy of my slides, I'd be more than happy to share them. Yeah.
There's a lot of key information there, and regarding school food in Canada, like the history and the examples that we have that have informed the direction that you are taking it, and others. When you mentioned that no money was attached to the initial budget, How is that even possible?
We have governments in Canada that are very good at making aspirational promises, but
Okay.
not doing a whole heck of a lot. I'm
Right.
sure most of us have observed that. So that's where the cynical side of me, that's what I think. But what's been interesting is to see that with the pressure that has been put on them by the 200 plus members of the Coalition for Healthy School Food, then in the 2021 election, you start to see the Liberals, the NDP, the Bloc, everyone but the Conservatives make a commitment, a financial commitment towards a national school food program. So there is, right now, the federal government is currently actually consulting. So I have a meeting with Minister Gold from Child, Family, Social Development next week. There's a whole bunch of us that have been invited to that meeting. So the federal government is consulting, and we're hearing that there's a possibility there will be a financial commitment coming in the next federal budget. I mean, I'm a bit of a cynic on those kinds of things, so I don't want to, put too much weight in that. But I think that the kind of pressure that has been on the federal government has had an effect, and it appears as if we may start to have some funding allocations. So most countries that have, the best programs, so the examples that I would say are some of the best globally, Finland, Japan, France, Italy, although Italy is a bit more complicated. There's a number of countries that have really, really good school food programs. Most of them didn't start all at once. They started with like a region of a country, and they slowly grew. And so that's my guess as to what might happen in Canada.
Okay, thank you very much. Yep.
So the coalition, yes. What the Coalition for Healthy School Food is asking for is $1 billion over 5 years in budget 2023 to establish a national school nutritious meal program as a key element of the evolving school food policy or food policy for Canada, with $200 million per year to contribute to provinces, territories, and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit partners. That's what the Coalition for Healthy School Food is asking for. We'll see. We'll see what happens. So there's also, is that actually from you? That's from somebody else, but. They all have my name. Oh, okay. So the question is, we have a study ongoing here in Saskatoon, where we've worked with two intervention schools, and comparing them to two control schools. The two intervention schools have universal curriculum integrated school lunch programs. And we're actually doing a comparison to the schools that are not receiving that program, using a number of both like quantitative measures and doing qualitative research on them. So that study is ongoing right now. The intervention schools, there are folks from those schools in this room. So we are trying to do research to establish a strong evidence base for the benefits of school food programs in Canada, because this is one of the problems we struggle with, is that most of the evidence we're drawing upon is not Canadian evidence. And so the study that we're conducting, and that's one of them, is trying to do this. So we're working on that here. I didn't want to talk about that in detail here, but if anybody wants to hear about that study, there's both people who are experiencing it and those of us who are working on it in this room right now. I think the question, though, was about tools and, so anything that we have developed, any tool, anything from the surveys of parents to any other kind of data collection tool that we have developed, like we've got a lot of them at this point, we will share freely with anybody who would like to use it. So if you want to evaluate your program and the tools, and you think the tools that we have could be of use to you, you are welcome to them. And I'd also be more than willing to give advice on how to do that and so on, if that's something you're interested in.
Another question there. Based on your knowledge, awareness, and expertise from research, what funding model would be best and most appropriate for school food programs? Pay as you can from parental contributions may add burden to families who are already challenged.
Oh, I hate answering this question. Honestly, in a country as rich as Canada, every child should receive a meal for free at school. That's my real answer. But we live in a country where culturally I'm not convinced we're there yet. I'm not convinced that the majority of the Canadian population would say that every child should receive a free meal at school. So there's always this constant argument between my justice side and my pragmatic side. So I don't know that we're in the short term going to get to a place of free meals for every child at school. I think we're more likely to have a model where parents contribute a portion of the cost. But if that were to happen, it has to be done in a way where nobody knows who has contributed and who hasn't. So there are systems, there are places where they do this and they do it well. There are places where they do it really badly, but there are places where they do it really well. And in those places, there's something completely, often separate from the school, where parents go onto a website and they contribute it, similar to EDSB here in Saskatoon. They go on, they pay a fee, and nobody knows who's paid and who hasn't. So I'll come back to, in a country as rich as Canada, every child should receive a meal for free at school. However, I think we're more likely to get something where parents are asked to make a contribution.
Any other questions? I do have one. When you look at the examples globally, are there some particular arrangements that look better than others, as far as cost sharing or how it's taken care of financially?
Frankly, I'm not sure interestingly, the best example, so Finland is probably one of my favorite examples, but it's completely free for every child. And Finland is a really interesting example. They have both both kitchens in some schools and centralized kitchens, so where they prepare meals and send them out to a number of schools. They have teachers eating with kids, which I think is a really, teachers and other school staff eating with kids, which I think is also a really interesting and important component socially. But it's completely free, so that doesn't exist. Japan, which I would say is probably one of the next best. It's also a really interesting program. Kids serve each other in the classroom, so kids are really integrated into the program. Parents do pay. Parents pay all the food costs, and all the labor costs are paid for by school districts and government. But as far as I can tell from the details that I have, it's not like you have to prove that you can't afford it in order to not pay, which brings a whole lot of issues that to me are really, really critical issues to deal with. So I think Japan is an excellent example on everything except for that one piece. As far as I can tell, the examples where parents pay a portion of the cost and nobody knows, and it's done well, are mostly local scale. They're small scale examples. There's an example in Vancouver. There's some examples in Atlantic Canada and so on, but not, as far as I know, not at the country. At the country level, there's still a lot of means testing, way too much means testing, and frankly, means testing it's a waste of resources in addition to everything else. It's really expensive. So the U.S. is actually moving away to some degree from means testing in the breakfast programs, especially, but yeah. Anything else?
Thank you very much. That was really great to see not only what we've discussed here locally, but also globally, and some of the research around it was very interesting. Thank you.